Canada just walked into Washington, and this time it wasn't empty-handed. Yesterday, Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc flew to Washington with Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charette. He met with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer and handed him a formal legal letter notifying that Canada wants CUSMA renewed for 16 years, until 2042. The same deal, extended, stable, done. That letter wasn't a request. It was Canada laying its cards on the table in writing, 28 days before the July 1st deadline. What Carney said at his cabinet meeting in Ottawa yesterday morning shows why this move is stronger than it seems. Washington has 30 issues with Canada in the CUSMA negotiation. 30. That sounds like a lot, until you hear the next number. Washington has nearly 60 issues with Mexico. 60. Canada isn't the tough case, it's the easier deal. And Canada just walked into Washington and said, "Let's make this happen." My name is Robert Hale. This is Canada Stands. Here's what went down yesterday and what it means for the next 28 days. Let's start with what LeBlanc's visit actually was, because both the optics and the substance matter. He traveled to the Canadian Embassy and held a press conference on the terrace with Canada's chief negotiator beside him. That was deliberate. Canada isn't negotiating in back rooms hoping nobody notices. Canada is negotiating openly, transparently, with its position clear for every Canadian to see. The letter delivered to Greer formally recommends a 16-year renewal of CUSMA. That's Canada's opening stance, straightforward, clean, and consistent with what the Bank of Canada, the business community, and every major economic institution has said is the right outcome. No games, no conditions. Canada wants the deal extended. Here's the letter. Let's talk. LeBlanc also met with U.S. lawmakers on Capitol Hill, the senators and congressmen who actually have to live with the economic consequences of whatever happens on July 1st. The same lawmakers whose constituents work in auto plants, farms, and manufacturing facilities that rely on the integrated North American supply chain that CUSMA protects. Those conversations matter. Every American legislator LeBlanc speaks to is a potential ally when Trump's position starts threatening American jobs. Now, let's discuss the number that changes everything, the one Carney dropped almost casually at his cabinet meeting yesterday morning, and that most coverage missed. Washington has roughly 30 issues with Canada in the CUSMA negotiation. Washington has roughly 60 issues with Mexico. Think about that. The Trump administration has been painting Canada as the difficult partner, the country that retaliated, the one in a different spot, the hard one to deal with. Greer even said it publicly at the Council on Foreign Relations last week. Canada is the problem. But the numbers tell a different story. Mexico, praised by the Trump administration for negotiating in good faith, has twice as many outstanding issues with Washington as Canada does. Mexico has structural challenges with rules of origin, Chinese manufacturing content flowing through its factories into the American market, labor standards, and automotive supply chain issues that are genuinely complex and contested. Canada's 30 issues are real, but manageable. Dairy market access, the Online Streaming Act, lumber, softwood, the auto content rules Trump wants shifted to 50% American-made. These are negotiable. Not because Canada will give in, but because each has a solution both sides can live with if there's political will. Canada is the easier deal. Canada walked into Washington yesterday and reminded them of that fact. Now, let's dive into what the LeBlanc visit really meant. The optics of the press conference were deliberate. Canada wasn't hiding behind closed doors. LeBlanc stood publicly on the embassy terrace with chief negotiator Janice Charette, signaling transparency and confidence. The letter to Greer was a clear, unambiguous opening, a 16-year renewal of CUSMA, consistent with what the Bank of Canada, the business community, and major economic institutions had advocated. No strings, no theatrics, just Canada putting its stance firmly on the table. Beyond that, LeBlanc met with U.S. lawmakers on Capitol Hill, those whose constituents' livelihoods depend on integrated North American industries, from auto plants to farms to manufacturing hubs. Each conversation could translate into support for Canada if U.S. policy threatened jobs. These dialogues matter because every lawmaker he engages becomes a potential ally when Trump's approach risks harming American employment. Then there's a critical context Carney offered at his Ottawa cabinet meeting. Washington has roughly 30 issues with Canada in the CUSMA negotiation, but almost 60 with Mexico. That's a striking comparison. Despite the narrative portraying Canada as the difficult partner, Mexico, praised publicly for its cooperation, actually has twice as many issues. Mexico grapples with rules of origin, Chinese manufactured content entering its factories, labor standards, and automotive supply chain complexities. Canada's challenges, dairy market access, online streaming regulations, lumber and softwood, auto content rules, are significant but solvable. Each has a potential compromise if both sides show political will. In essence, Canada is the simpler, more manageable partner, and by stepping into Washington yesterday, it reinforced that reality. Now, let's break down the new development in the negotiations: bifurcated discussions. For most of the past year, CUSMA was treated as a trilateral process, Canada, the United States, and Mexico all at the table, since legally all three must agree. What Carney confirmed is that Washington is now handling separate bilateral conversations with Canada and Mexico, addressing each country's specific issues independently before any trilateral meeting. This makes sense because each country presents different challenges. For Canada, it's an opportunity. In a three-way negotiation, Canada and Mexico could be played against each other, with Washington threatening to favor one over the other. In bilateral talks, Canada stands on its own, its 30 issues considered on their own merits. With fewer issues, clearer positions, and stronger alternatives, Canada has more leverage here than in a trilateral setting, where Mexico's 60 issues could dominate discussions. Carney's team recognized this, and the decision to pursue bifurcated talks works in Canada's favor. Canada showed up prepared for exactly this format. Most viewers aren't following Canada's stands closely, but with 28 days to July 1st, every move counts. Turning to the substance of what Washington wants, LeBlanc's visit doesn't signal concession, it signals negotiation. Trump's main demand is the auto rule, a new requirement that at least 50% of vehicle content be made in the United States. Currently, 75% of content must be North American, which can include Canadian or Mexican parts. Trump wants that content strictly American. Canada's auto industry is deeply intertwined with the U.S. industry, with parts crossing borders multiple times before vehicles are finished. Ford in Oakville and Windsor, Stellantis in Windsor, Toyota in Cambridge and Woodstock. All these plants employ tens of thousands of Canadians and form supply chains that American factories can't replicate quickly or cheaply. Canada argues the integrated supply chain benefits both nations. Restricting content to 50% U.S. would raise vehicle costs, hitting American consumers, dealers, and automakers lobbying against the rule, leaving them at a disadvantage against foreign manufacturers. LeBlanc presented this not as a threat, but as an economic reality both sides must acknowledge. As of today, 28 days before July 1st, Canada has formally requested a 16-year renewal, is negotiating directly in bifurcated talks where its 30 issues aren't overshadowed by Mexico's 60, and has spent the past month strengthening European alliances, Arctic agreements, NATO partnerships, and defense industrial base ties, proving real alternatives exist to reliance on Washington. The next 28 days will reveal whether these alternatives suffice for a deal Canada can accept, or whether talks extend into annual reviews through the fall. Either way, Canada is prepared. What's unacceptable is trading Canadian sovereignty, dairy, cultural policy, or auto manufacturing for the illusion of stability. Here's the bottom line. Yesterday, Canada's Trade Minister LeBlanc flew to Washington with Canada's chief negotiator and formally delivered Canada's position to the United States. Renew CUSMA for 16 years. Simple, clean, stable. Washington has roughly 30 issues with Canada, half as many as it has with Mexico. The talks are now bifurcated, giving Canada a bilateral forum where its issues can be addressed without Mexico's complications dominating the conversation. Canada is not pleading. Canada is not panicking. It walked into Washington with a clear stance, a strong negotiating record, and 28 days to reach a deal that protects Canadian workers, farmers, and sovereignty. 28 days. Canada is at the table. The question is whether Washington is ready to deal. Subscribe to Canada Stands, hit the bell, and share this with anyone following the CUSMA countdown who needs to understand what's really happening. When the world shifts, Canada stands.